Good morning, Freddie. Nice to see you.
Good morning. Nice to see you. Actually, nice to see you this time because obviously I haven't seen you in a little bit. It's been a week or so. Finally moved down to Canberra, got settled in my little house, which is why obviously this setup is not the usual setup, slightly different to what you'd expect, but I'm doing all right. Headphones slightly lower quality. We're gonna make it work. So
Yes, first time we're doing the podcast in different locations. So nice to see you, darling. Um, Today we're going to talk about several things. First of all, the Munich Security Conference and JD Vance's speech there, which has caused huge uproar in Europe. The current negotiations between Russia and the US regarding Ukraine. The recent terrorist attack in Munich, which is in terribly bad timing. uh, Tariffs and some of the confusion there. And then finally coming to the Australian zone, Dutton ahead in the polls.
So lots of really interesting stuff. Interesting and depressing stuff, but that's every week. It never seems to relent, to be honest. Remember the days when politics was only for like a select few who got the time to talk about it at dinner parties, but now it feels like no one can escape it, no matter what they do. No matter if they have a full-time job and have to go home to look after everyone in the family, they really have to know about politics because it is impacting them so much
Every
to a
night
great
there's new
extent.
dramas. Every night you wake up from the US in Australia, there's new dramas to read about and think about.
Exactly, exactly. It's very true.
So
So, where you
let's
go?
start. Go ahead.
No, let's start with the Vance speech, which you must have heard a little bit about, but we're going to go into it. So obviously, Vice President Vance did a speech at the Munich Security Conference, and this happened the day also after a terrorist attack happened in Munich. So obviously, the city has been through a lot in terms of terrorist attacks. It's really horrific timing, considering the election is coming up soon and the perpetrator of the attack was from Afghanistan. And he was set to be deported back to Afghanistan because of security conditions. The German government decided to keep him in Germany. So obviously that had certain ramifications to all the people, condolences to all the people who were involved. As I'm aware, I think 30 people were injured. I'm not sure how many people were killed, if anyone was killed. I'm not sure there's certain statistics on that, but just a horrific thing to be happening, honestly.
Yeah, really horrific, and horrific a week before the main German elections,
Mm-hmm.
because for those of you who may not know, the Alternative for Deutschland's a right-wing party, and they were coming third in the polls. There's talk that they might come second in the polls with this because, an Afghan refugee was the one who drove the car into the crowd. I mean, the timing couldn't be worse, right, to boost the fortunes of the AFD
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
And
You,
so
you may find it strange. Sorry, I'll just interrupt here for a second. You may find it strange that we're saying, oh, terrible timing. That may seem a bit unfeeling, a bit empathetic, but the reality of this is that the effect this will have on people within Germany is massive, is undeterminable, because the AfD are essentially the Nazi Party reborn, and the policies they have seek to like destroy the lives of immigrants. So this one act by this one person can have such far-reaching implications that were already increasing in likelihood. So that's well. Now you go. Sorry.
So next morning, JD Vance, Vice President of the US, spoke to the Munich Security Conference, which has been a yearly event for as long as I can remember. And his speech was a little bizarre. It was incredibly arrogant, saying the European society was screwed up and they don't allow freedom of speech and they're very woke. And, an example was Alternative for Deutschland not allowing, in Germany, not allowing people freedom of speech to say what they want, even though Germany has very strict laws, given their history of the Nazis, of what you
Mm-hmm.
can and can't say and can and can't do, which I think is very appropriate. And it was really tone deaf, Vance's speech in terms of the history of Europe, etc., etc. And I think it really shocked the European leaders. And, this is all on the back of bizarre discussions around Ukraine and negotiations directly between the US and Russia without Vladimir Zelensky, without Ukraine being involved, which is also bizarre given they have to, and the Europeans need to live with any peace agreement that is struck. So I think Europe's in total panic, the leaders, and thus they scheduled an emergency summit in Paris, which happened last night.
Yeah, well, obviously, we'll get onto that a bit later, because we've got a lot more to say about the emergency meeting. Got a lot more to say about the Munich Security Conference first, but I would say it's interesting, the foreign policy playbook that America have been putting out at the moment, considering their entire rhetoric is that they don't get involved in other countries' issues and policy, but this is the most involved they've ever been in the history of America. They've never been so involved in the outcome of any European election. Well, I mean, except maybe some of the previous Soviet-held countries, because they had a lot more influence there, but not in this modern era of democracy, I suppose. So that's quite shocking, to be honest, and it's terrifying, yeah, because going back to Germany, the specific structures they have in place is that every major party in the country basically has an agreement that they won't work with far-right parties no matter what, extremist far-right parties no matter what, even if they're a right-wing party. They have an agreement to not do that because that's just a tipping point that can, turn into disaster, and they're fully aware of that. So I know that even the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, that's what it's called, right? Angela Merkel's former party, we talked about that a little bit in one of the other episodes. They have previously agreed with the AfD on some policies, and that's the beginning of the end. As soon as they breach that line, right, it feels like there's no turning back. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, look, it's just a different philosophy. There's one school of thought that says you should allow freedom of speech whether people like it or not, and generally I'm in favor of that. But you've got to take into account the history of a country. The US history is very different to the history of Germany, okay? And so they haven't experienced yet a dictator, an evil dictator, as Germany has. And they have particular religious views. I mean, the other bizarre part of his speech was he was having a go at the UK, and someone being convicted of being close to an abortion clinic. And, those laws are in place in the UK so that people who choose to go and have an abortion are not threatened and harassed by people close to an abortion clinic. And Vance was saying this person was prosecuted just for praying, XYZ within, a few hundred meters of this abortion clinic, which seems bizarre that someone can be arrested for that. I get it, but you've got to look at the context of why it was put in. So that was the other
Definitely.
bizarre example in his speech, and this intervention in a country's internal domestic politics.
I mean, you can also see, though, in that situation, right, considering what's going on with the US and abortion, the way that these acts of intimidation by MAGA supporters, intimidating women into not getting abortions, and these whole abortion centers that they've set up to make them out like Planned Parenthood, but they're secretly not. They're like fanatic religious pro-lifers inside waiting for you to come in and convince you to not get an abortion. So you can understand why someone would be arrested for displaying some kind of religious devotion near an abortion clinic, because they could be seeking to intimidate a woman on her way in there to, do what she's like lawfully allowed to do.
Mhm.
Lawfully has a right to do. So you can understand why someone would be arrested for that. Why do you need to pray next to an abortion clinic? Why does it matter? Surely if the police had asked him, can you move somewhere else, he should have been able to do that. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that he didn't. So then obviously Vance takes someone like this, makes it out to be an insane situation and turns him into a martyr. But he's just a weird guy.
Mhm.
To bring back the
No,
slogan of the Kamala campaign, they're just weird. Just a bit weird.
I think the shocking thing for me is that I think the Europeans were really shocked. This was much worse than they sort of anticipated. And the silver lining might be this might really jolt the Europeans into doing something finally. They've been very slow to act. And the fact that Keir Starmer has come out overnight saying it's under the right circumstances, he's willing to put British boots on the ground in Ukraine is really good, right? Because it's got him out of his hole, and maybe Macron will say the same thing, and maybe Germany will say the same thing, and
Mm.
suddenly things can be looking a little different with true European leadership. Because I tell you, they better step into the breach because nobody else will.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with that, but I think you have to understand that it can be difficult to change so like great number of countries' entire foreign policy in a matter of weeks. It was since their countries were, you know, put into the modern era, since World War II, they have been supported by America. One of the great foundations of Europe as a whole is the fact that it's supported by America, and the fact that America has given it so much funding and a space to talk with freedom of speech and a space to become the great union that it is today, is in a large part due to American interference, you could say.
Or
So
assistance, maybe in a more positive way, the
assistance,
Marshall
int
Plan and all of that.
yeah, interference in a good way, you can still say, but they were interfering. But it did, turn out to be a good thing in this one situation. But so you can understand how a country who believes in everything America is and bases all of its policy and all its lifestyle off the American lifestyle, how these countries can suddenly find themselves lost in a sea of confusion. They're like, what do we do? We just
I
wanted to be like them. Now who do we be like?
I agree, but they should realize, look at the speed with which the US is moving, whether you agree with
Mm,
Trump's policies or not. It's a wake-up call for the Europeans. They need to speed up their whole process, and they need to speed
yeah.
up their economy and their productivity. This is a real wake-up call for Europe, and they'll either step up or it will become even more chaotic.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. It's going to be a real test for all of them to see what's going to happen in this time. And it's interesting how even, not sure if I mentioned this, but how some far right, not far right, but right-wing parties in different European countries are even stepping up against this idea of disastrous Europe and it's going the wrong way. Like they're stepping up against that, even though, traditionally maybe they'd agree with Trump. They
Right.
believe in the idea of Europe and they
Right.
love
Well, that's
Europe.
good.
And so for Vance to criticize Europe and this thing that they love, I don't think it's a good step in the right direction.
No, I just think it came across as very arrogant and
Mm,
somewhat uninformed of history, which is surprising because he's a smart guy and obviously has incredibly good advisors, etc. So,
well,
um,
yeah. I mean, I suppose he's a smart guy. He sounds a little bit like some kind of psychopath, to be honest. You remember back to all that stuff that people said about him during the election, how he used to be quite a progressive guy. He used to have that he had a trans friend who had a testimony about him saying that he brought him cookies after top surgery and stuff like this. To turn from that person into the person he is now just really reflects that he like sold out to power. So how
mhm.
little his morals have an effect of him on him is, remarkable. Because I don't think most right-wing leaders had such a massive transition. I don't think Donald Trump was, advocating for environmental sustainability when he was a kid, you know.
Right, right. Well, he's vice president of the US, so he's done rather well. Let's
Yes, he
move.
sold out. It's,
Yes.
I would argue that it's easier to do better in the right wing because all you need to do is act like a loon and say crazy shit, and then people become a little bit obsessed with you. Whereas in the Democratic Party, you have to have proper policies and you have to work your way to the top. We all saw how the debates played out. I mean, JD
Mhm.
Vance did have a fairly good debate, but we're not saying he's not smart, but that shouldn't be appreciated so much when he has horrific values.
Hmm. So it'll be very interesting. And just the scene in the Munich Security Conference with all these European generals and politicians watching JD Vance looking stony faced. It was fascinating theatre.
Mm-hmm.
at, at very least.
Theatre.
Uh,
God.
the other big thing is the US has announced broad-ranging tariffs beyond steel and aluminium for the rest of the world. And bizarrely, looking at VAT and GST as some sort of protectionist thing that the US needs to put tariffs up against. And I don't quite understand it. And it was interesting. I was watching a show last night, and the foreign minister of Canada was asked, what are they going to do about that? And she looked quizzical that they're a bit confused about the whole US approach and they're looking into it. And this is typical, right, of Trump's strategy. He likes to sow confusion and move quickly. And every day there's a new announcement, there's a new executive
He
order.
does. But can I also say quickly, because you often sound like you're in admiration of his strategy, but what she just said is she's confused. It doesn't make any logical sense. Yes, maybe it's confusing, and that's what he's trying to do, but there's a point where confusing can only get so far. And there's a point where the country will not respect the decisions that he's making anymore, and he's going to be in a whole lot of shit. So I don't think there should be so much admiration for trying to manipulate an entire country into respecting you.
Let's see the outcome. I'll hold
Let's
my
see the outcome.
well, let's see the outcome because I think his strategy is to confuse and destabilize people and then negotiate a better deal for the US on that basis of confusion and people
They
feeling
already have
insecure.
great deals. They have
Well,
excellent
he
deals with the
doesn't
rest of the
perceive that,
world.
darling. He feels like they've been ripped off for years by Europe and everyone else. So that's the
Mm.
perception. And so it'll be
Because this is what
fascinating.
everyone said. They were like, he's a businessman. We want America to be run like a business. I like it now because
Well, they love it. He's very popular, darling. Popularity's through the roof. And there's not much opposition to what he's doing. So, as we discussed
it's
last
the
time, so,
Democratic Party in the
oh,
structural.
generally.
No, like we said last time, there's been a lot of opposition and there's been a lot of protests and a lot of cultural figures talking about how they feel. That's
Okay,
not nothing.
maybe I'm just not seeing it, not on mainstream
And that
media.
worries me. That worries me that your mainstream media is on the right-hand side of things,
Well, I'm not sure
what you're
it's on the
descending
right-hand
into.
side, but it's
Well,
I'm not
I'm not
seeing.
seeing any of the shit that you're seeing. So that's something to say at least. Anyway, let's move on from that.
Uh,
So
and
Ukraine.
let
Are we going to talk a bit more about Ukraine?
well, yes, we can.
Because you rushed into earlier, and now we need to actually go into it. Let's
Okay,
just start.
so Trump has had a call with Putin, and now his people are in Saudi and the Russians are in Saudi, but Vladimir Zelensky was not invited. Interestingly,
Vladimir.
Interestingly, he's in Dubai at the moment, so close by. So I think on the anticipation that he gets invited at the last minute or
Uh,
something.
I don't know
Um,
about that.
it's all very strange. And of course, the Europeans said they should be involved, and they were told no, they're not invited. The whole thing is totally bizarre because you come to agreement, and then you say to the Ukrainians and the Europeans, "Oh, you've got to enforce this."
Yeah, well, it's scary because I've read a lot about from professional negotiators or professionals in diplomacy in general being like, well, this isn't how it's run, and Trump's going to figure it out sooner or later, but this is not how a negotiation will take place. It won't be effective, it won't happen. But I think these people are again underestimating Trump and the influence he has, and what if America and Russia get together, what they can do
Hmm.
as a collective. I don't think that it matters what is a typical negotiation or not, because he's an authoritarian figure. He doesn't care what the normal thing is to do. He's going to do what he wants to do and make an impact no matter what. It's like you think about the Gulf of America, how it's now the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico. I will continue calling it the Gulf of Mexico for as long as I live, because since the 1600s or something, since people like first sailed into that area, it's been called the Gulf of Mexico, maybe even prior. And the fact that on a whim he could make a confusing statement as to confuse the population and then just get it changed forever. What's going to happen? Are we going to have the Pacific Ocean bracket Trump on the world map for the rest of our lives? The world bracket Trump's version. Like, I wouldn't be so hard pressed to imagine that. So yeah, it's scary when you see all this typical foreign policy analysis and they're like, oh, well, it's not going to work. It
But
could work.
it will be fascinating because Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, I always think Foreign Secretary, but Secretary of State in the U.S. Look, he's quite a mature and responsible kind of person. He's a more
Oh my
traditional
God, the things
Repu-
you say
No,
sometimes.
he's a more traditional Republican, so he's the one negotiating in Saudi. So it will be fascinating what comes out of it.
It will be. It will be. Look, I don't think you can really be a traditional Republican and coordinate with Russia to the extent that the US is at the moment. I don't think Republicans in the past were that keen on Russia. What about the whole
Hmm.
McCarthy movement?
Yep.
What about the Cold War? I don't think Republicans were that keen on communicating with them or having anything to do with them whatsoever. So I don't know how Republican that is. Maybe it's very MAGA, not so
Yeah.
very Republican in my
Well,
opinion.
read a bit more about Marco Rubio. He's probably on the left
I think
wing
I
of the MAGA
have
movement.
read a bit about him, but sure, I'll read a bit and come up with a scathing analysis for you next time. If that makes you feel
Um,
better.
shall we move on to Australia because we're running short on time?
Oh yeah, that's true. I actually have to leave in a bit for university because that's what I do with my time. And this one will have to leave to go to a Pilates class or something. So that'll be good for him. But I'm sorry, let's move on to
The
Australia.
beach, actually, today.
The beach. Oh, okay. Well, nice.
So, latest news is that Dutton's ahead in the polls. An election has not been called yet, but today there is expected to be an interest rate
Mm-hmm.
um, statement from the Reserve Bank, a potential cut in interest rates of 0.25%, which will be very good news for the government, but the recent polls are not good news for the government.
No, of course not. And I think they have to call the election before May 17th. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Hmm.
I think that's like the final date they need to call it. So I don't know if he's trying to just drag it out as long as possible or what, because trying to see if somehow something flips in his favor. Um, but do we want to go into a little bit how the preferential voting system works in Australia, in case there's anyone listening who doesn't understand the system?
Maybe we'll go into it next.
Next time?
Right.
Okay, okay. We'll do it next time. So get excited for that. We'll just do a little rundown. But yeah, so obviously all the major polling companies in Australia, there's a few of them which are funded by different media outlets, etc., etc. They've all been saying that the coalition is quite far in the lead. I don't think any of them are looking to win a majority government. I don't think that's likely. There's like 19% chance that the coalition could win a majority government, but that's pretty small.
And so the Teals the crossbench will hold the balance of power.
Yeah.
And there's talk that they should retain their seats. So it's interesting. They've become a very important political force in the country.
Mm. It is interesting, and I don't know if you heard about this, but on this is all on the back of a policy that was passed a little while ago, a law. I'm forgetting the right term for it right now, but something that was passed about a week ago saying that independents can only get a certain amount of funding, whereas major parties can get
Yes, the
massive
funding
amounts
reform.
of funding. Yeah, which obviously was just the two parties coming together to try and kick
Hmm.
independents out of the system, rather than being mature and accepting the system as it is. They decide to stick themselves in the past and not understand that Australians want something different from their
Hmm.
politics.
Yes, agreed. And
It's
the
disappointing
details
again,
of
especially from the Labor Party, I would say. Sorry, you go.
no, I agree, Freddie. And the details of that are there's a maximum you can spend on any one candidate, $800,000 for an election. So let's take Allegra Spender, right? She can spend 800,000. The Liberal candidate can spend 800,000. But the Liberal Party, if they're not mentioning the name of their candidate, can spend up to 90 million on that one seat. So you
Yeah.
see, it's really bizarre. And so there was talk last night, her being interviewed, should they form a Teal party? to get around these laws, right? And she said no, but you never know whether that might happen.
I mean, if I was a teal, I would be incredibly open to it.
I
I
agree.
don't see a problem with that really. They need to have a stronger front, and then they could really play a part against this. Because at the moment, essentially, the two main parties are helping Australia turn into what America is now.
Hmm.
Because obviously, if you force everyone into a two-party system and you take all the power away from all the independents, that's what's going to happen eventually. It's just going to polarize people to a greater and greater extent. And
Yeah.
obviously, the Labour Party's gotten pretty moderate at the moment and isn't exactly that progressive with their policies as much as the Liberal Party likes to say they're part of the woke agenda. There's a lot more they could be doing to help people
Mhm.
that they're not doing and that they've always prided themselves on, but suddenly has fallen away as soon as they got into government. So
We'll
interesting.
talk much more about the Australian election in future episodes. Thank you for joining us. Again, make sure you share and like this with your friends. We'd love to have more followers. And Freddie, thanks for joining and have a lovely day.
Thanks for joining me as well. It's nice to see all of you. We love you. We appreciate you. See you next time.